Run from the vet school all the way to the art squad, but it's 11:15, so I think we should begin again. So this final session before lunch is devoted to a book we've already heard about last night that influenced at least 2 members of Congress and hopefully more, but surely not as many as we might have hoped. That is, of course, Walt's study, Inevitable Revolutions, his study of U.S. foreign relations in Latin America and its many misadventures. And so to reflect upon that work, we have 2 of Walt's graduate students from the 1990s. So Lorena Oropeza, who finished her degree in 1995, and Jim Siekmeier, who got his PhD in 1992. So Lorena?
Thank you. So actually on the diploma it says 96 because I graduated like really late August, like 24 hours before I started a job at University of California, Davis. So I started my job as an assistant professor because I had a PhD in hand and I made more than $4,000 a year. And I was at UC Davis for most of my career. Recently, in the history department, I transferred to the University of California-Berkeley. And I'm now in ethnic studies, and that's actually pertinent to what I want to talk to you all about today. What I'll say to start is that this book is really the reason I came to study at Cornell. And for personal reasons, I'd already decided, not knowing anything about graduate school, that I was going to go to Cornell, that I was going to get a PhD, that I was going to be in history. The question was, with whom? So what I did was I read every single book by every historian in the department, and then when I read Inevitable Revolutions, like, that's it, I'm done. And part of the reason is I graduated from high school in 1982. And Tucson, my hometown, was a sanctuary city. And Juan Carlos from El Salvador was my friend. And he never said everybody, he always said every bloody. And it was like this horrible joke that never ended. So it turns out in the summer of 1982, Walt also wrote an article for the Atlantic Monthly. And it is the kind of the nucleus of what became Inevitable Revolutions. And in that article, he made 3 big interventions. And my instructions were we're supposed to summarize the article. So I'm going to tell you that this is how we built the article. And if you want to know more about the process, I had the best partner, let me just say that. So in that article in the Atlantic Monthly, he made 3 interventions, and they extend backwards and forwards in time in Inevitable Revolutions, and you can also find them in the earlier work on the Panama Canal. And the first intervention, and I don't think we really talk about Walt this way, but he was really clear. He was dispelling ignorance. There was a certain impatience he had with the vast ignorance of the American populace. And the second intervention he wanted to make was that this was really a counterproductive policy. And it comes up in a lot of his books, but as he said in that Atlantic Monthly article, these are the sort of policies that foment the revolutions that they presumably are meant to avoid or avert. And then the third intervention is that in both of these, in the article and then in both of the books and the subsequent editions, there is a call to action. Like he's writing in a deliberate attempt to affect policy. And for that reason and for others, Jim and I decided to call him a scholar activist, and we are certain that he would have hated this term because it's very presentist, right? And it's very applied. It's not like in this hallowed history academic realm. And yet we used it anyway because he trained us, and we have evidence to prove our argument. So let me just take you a little bit through all 3 of these buckets. And before I do, I just want to say this concept that there's 3 parts, and then we have conclusions. I borrowed it from this man that we know very well and we loved. So in honor of Walt, the 3 buckets. The first one about dispelling ignorance. I have to say that, there was a poll at the time, and most Americans couldn't tell you if you're looking at Central America, and I think the same is true today, because I took this test with my graduate students just on Tuesday. If you have a map of Central America, how do you know which country is which? Could you name them? Which is Honduras, which is Guatemala, which is El Salvador? And they were like, no. And during the 1980s, it was really hard for Americans to even know which country the Reagan administration, which government it was trying to topple, and which one it was trying to topple the left-wing counterinsurgency or the insurgency. So it's like there's a vast ignorance, and it comes across really, really powerfully in that Panama Canal book, where he, on one of the first pages, he quotes a captain and goes like, yeah, 80% of Americans never want to give up the canal. The same percentage have no idea where it is. It's like, yes. So, and then he did it. So this is the first bucket. How did he dispel ignorance? All of the, last night I noticed it was really about teaching undergraduates, but really the beauty of the way he taught and the beauty of the way he delivered lectures, they were absolutely clear. He was a master storyteller, but he had a point. It wasn't, and it was really, it was structured, it was structured and personal and powerful. And all of his teaching mastery, he poured into this volume. Inevitable Revolution tells you about 5 countries and the United States. It takes you across around 500 years of history. And he manages to hold it all together. He does it through his crystal clear prose. He does it through the liberal use of maps. He does it through, and we'll get to this at the second bucket, through a term he came up with called neo-dependency, and I promise I'll tell you more about that. But just in terms of his ability to get his point across and his ability to recognize that the nuances, to hold that much history together in that short of a book. I just assigned for the graduate students in a course I'm teaching on race and American empire, Greg Grandin's Empire's Workshop. And what a woman from Brazil said is like, and it's a great book. I mean, there's a lot, I'm not tearing down that book, but what a graduate student from Brazil said is that Grandin treats Latin America like a monolith, right? Because if you're looking at US foreign policy, it's US out. And Walt didn't do that. In Inevitable Revolutions, not only does he tell you the differences among these countries, but he really makes clear how different Central America is from the rest of Latin America and the intensity of US involvement there. So that's the first bucket, is about dispelling ignorance. The second one is he really wanted to point how counterproductive these policies were. And so he did develop this term, neo-dependency. And I remember when we were talking about this last October, Andy says, no one really uses this term, right? And it's true. Scholars of American foreign relations do not go around saying, oh, that's neo-dependency. I found out that some scholars in the economic realm use it to talk about impoverished countries. And what Walt was doing by using this term, it itself, these books have their own history, is he was referring to and building upon the work of Latin American theorists and dependency theory. And I promise not to give you a lecture on dependency theory, but what we really need to know is that, I think it was Eric who talked about race. I mean, it's a response to theories coming out of the United States and elsewhere that, there's this first world that's really advanced economically and we're doing great, and the rest of the world will catch up at some point when they're not so far, when they'll reach this magic stage called takeoff, right? And that was modernization theory, that it's a series of stages, and then eventually the implication is backwards people will catch up. Dependency theorists said hey, we're poor because you're rich. Right? We weren't dependent on a single export crop because you set up the market and you set the price, and we suffer. So that it's poverty and riches, dependency, and in economic power. These are what he would say the same walnut or 2 sides of the same coin, right? So this is, and so he was interested in this theory, but a little bit scared of it too. And you have to look at the footnotes. You can always see the other side of the book by looking at the footnotes, no? And so he has this really long footnote in the Panama Canal saying theory? Well, I don't know. Maybe informal colonialism, but that's not it. Maybe, and he comes to he thanks Tom Holloway for helping him understand the intricacies of dependency theory. But when he gets inevitable revolutions, he's going to talk about a neo-dependency system. He doesn't even like the word theory, because that implies a certain rigidity, and like you march to a certain like set of, it doesn't deal with the nuance and tragedy and triumph of history. So he uses it, and then his fulcrum in Inevitable Revolutions to really talk about neo-dependency. And what he means is not just economic exploitation, because it's, especially in Central America, heavy-duty military intervention, right? And so he says, look, this is a bad idea. In the Atlantic Monthly article, it was a bad idea. He looks at the Alliance for Progress as a fulcrum. Right? This is Kennedy and this is Frank saying like, oh, Kennedy's a good guy in Latin America. There's been books written like, Kennedy's a good guy, like we have him on our wall because he had this idea that you can have development. But in Walt's reading, the Alliance for Progress, instead of uplifting Latin America in the wake of presenting an alternative to the Cuban Revolution, what it does is it raises expectations. And you can grow your economy and still have extraordinarily differences between the poor and the rich. Like the poor can remain poor and the economy can be booming, right? So what it did was raise expectations. It fed a revolution, a desire for change without satisfying that desire. So this is, again, fomenting the sort of politics that the United States supposedly wants to avoid. Okay. I'm just making sure that I have all of my dependency stuff done. So I want to talk just about how this was received, because this is another thing that's come up. I remember yesterday he was a Marxist. Some of the, I don't think so. Okay, so some of the leading theorists of dependency theory in Latin America definitely were Marxists. Like this, the only way you're going to change such a crooked, broken, exploitive system is through revolution, right? Walt was not an advocate of revolution, right? He was, and it has something to do with how we, that third bucket, how we get to that third bucket. And so there was one critique of the book, and this book came for some heavy-duty criticism that said he's an American Marxist historian. And his response was just typical of his grace and his wit. He said, essentially said, I wish. He said, the critic, he goes, ascribes to my work a consistency and coherence that unfortunately it does not have, right? He's not going to march to a single theory. He's going to take all the evidence and try to make sense of it. So there's another critique of his work that despite his attempt to try to get to the complications, the other critique, and this is, I think, also in tandem with thinking about race, is that it's a book that could be written at that time and probably not today because he only used English language sources. So I guess I heard yesterday he was really bad at French. Did I hear that? Yeah, he was really bad at Spanish too. So, and I am very clear that I love this man. I love learning from him. I loved the career and the future that he gave me, right? I worked really hard, but he opened that door. But nevertheless, every single semester when I TA'd, there's a moment where I was just going to just cringe, because I was Lorena Oropeza. That's not my name. So, and if you've never been named Italian food, you may not understand, but it was a little hard. Okay. Last bit, and this is a long bit. This is our scholar activism bucket. Is that these really were books that were meant to speak directly to policymakers. It makes sense that people were passing them out in Congress. And so the Panama Canal book, the first edition, came out right when the Senate was debating whether the United States should give the canal back to Panamanians. And Walt said, yeah, you should for these reasons. And then that's what happened, right? The Inevitable Revolutions, that first edition came out when the Reagan administration was going to embark on some really, really horrific interventions that were not just counterproductive, but it unleashed a decade of bloodletting, among those countries. And so he was extremely interested in stopping that sort of horror, that sort of tragedy. And he wasn't successful. So the second edition of Inevitable, I mean, how could one man be? That's not even fair, right? But 10 years later, he was lamenting the horror that was unleashed during the Reagan administration. And this idea that you could educate people, you could have reasoned debate, you could make a difference, you could have a call to action, that's all speaks, I think, to his fundamental faith in democracy, right? Change is not going to come through revolution. Revolutions are really messy and horrific. Change is going to come through some sort of reasoned debate and this education. And I think that sort of reification, and I mean, I share it, that of reasoned debate explains also how he understood democracy to be such a fragile enterprise, and I think that truth is apparent, like in today's politics, no? And in Inevitable Revolutions, you saw the fragility when he had devastating paragraphs around Contra, because that's executive run amok, right? Run amok, this man is not accountable, or either Reagan or Ollie North, who the hell knows, right? But not accountable to anyone. And then also when he really came down hard on the amount of surveillance that peace activists got during the 1980s, okay? So now I'm going to keep on going because this was our deep bucket. And I think this was the hardest part for Jim and I, because it's not like I could say like, hey, Walt, tell me what you're thinking, because I didn't have that kind of relationship with him. This is what we pieced together through our historical investigation, okay? And so when you have a faith in democracy and an understanding that's really fragile, and you put those two things together, I think that's why you have the response he had to the Willard Straight takeover. And which did the activists who were demanding curricular changes did eventually smuggle in guns, which to him was a violation. That is not reasoned debate. If one side is holding guns, you're kind of moved past reason and you're moving towards threat, no? And so when I heard the Beacon address, I had heard it on YouTube, but I had skipped to when he started talking to about Wilson. I hadn't heard that earlier part. And to me, this event in 1969 really is so important in understanding who he was as a person, right? And it's important in several ways. One is he wasn't at all sympathetic to the people protesting. I think it's also really important in 1993 when Latino students took over Day Hall without guns, without violence. He was also absolutely appalled, right? And he was appalled, and he wrote a letter to one of the leaders. That leader is going to be on the Sculptors of Modern America presentation tomorrow. And he said, despite their differences, like he modeled the behavior that he really valued. So Walt wrote Eduardo Peñalver a letter and explaining why he opposed the takeover of Day Hall, right? And to him, the university was this hallowed ground where this is where you have reasoned debate, right? And when you're talking about race in the United States, what is also historically true is that hallowed ground, those universities do not give space to these sort of curricular changes without protest action. And he didn't, like that was a connection he didn't make. And I found it, especially where I ended up, really interesting. The last thing I'll say about race is that the book, Inevitable Revolutions, the book that doesn't use Spanish sources, the book that is really, it is US-centric to a certain extent. Of course it is. It's about, this is a great empire. So what I tell my students, like, you should actually know something about this empire. It also paid attention to what I called in the article, the historic cheapness of brown lives. So in a really powerful essay he wrote, it's like sometimes death isn't enough. And there's a debate among scholars, like how much tragedy, how much graphic inhumanity do you put on the pages of a book, right? And so he was careful, but there is no doubt in my mind that he was absolutely motivated to stop the bloodletting that went on. And so in the end, it was sort of a wonderful opportunity to look at his ideas and the complexity of ideas, not just about US foreign policy, but about American democracy at home, right? In the end, we decided we had to call him a scholar activist, even though he's like, no, no, straight hall, no, day hall. He was a scholar activist because he was someone with the highest, absolutely highest historical standards, still had this unwavering belief that it was possible to effect change, that together we could make things better. And that's it, yeah.
Hello, I can't,
Yeah, just a quick question. Was Inevitable Revolutions translated into Spanish?
Nunca, no.
Never.
yeah, I'm Jim Siekmeier, and I can't really follow that, so I'm not going to. I was going to say a few things about how Inevitable Revolutions does a great job basically taking apart or taking down the U.S. supposed quest for stability in Central America. No, it's really not about that. U.S. quest for democracy in Central America. No, it's not really about that. But does it in a very judicious way, in a very historically grounded way, and also a scholar activist way at the same way. And that was, when you said great opportunity, this was a fantastic opportunity to try and figure out. So yeah, this is the book that caused me to go to grad school, not just Cornell, to go to grad school. And then now, near the end of my career, I'm thinking about what made this scholar work and what made this book work. But I do want to cite one quote from the book on stability. He says in Central America, the United States has worked really against democracy and stability in so many ways. And he says there's never going to be stability in Central America if you don't have independent and fair judiciary systems, consensus on political and secular norms, responsible governing institutions that can check as well as extend power, and a functioning economy providing the needs of life. Wow, that's a lot. That's a tall order, but that's right? And so the book is really about how U.S. policy has not been advancing that in Central America, and then maybe we can talk about other parts of the world as well. So I don't really want to say any more because I want to hear what other people have to say, except to maybe start with one question: why is it that former Congress people are buying 40 copies of this book and giving it to the powerful on Capitol Hill and Washington D.C.? What is it about this book that would cause them to do that?
Yeah. Or any other questions or comments?
Or any other questions or comments, yes.
You're just one.
When I read your chapter, it helped me think even more deeply about Walt's breadth as an intellectual and how he really was a person of his time, influenced and did influence others. And I was thinking that perhaps your chapter shows a complementarity because when the second edition of Inevitable Revolutions came out, the prior year, Frederick Pike's marvelous book, United States and Latin America, Myths and Stereotypes of Civilization and Nature came out. And I think some of the work that Walt put into Inevitable Revolutions was there in Pike. So I don't know if he knew Pike or Tom Holloway introduced him to Pike's work, but I find it there. And then the second thing I want to say is more of a comment. You mentioned Greg Grandin. Greg is very much a fan of Bill Williams, and I don't know if The Last Colonial Massacre could have been written, if Walt's mentioned in there. I just don't recall, but I know it couldn't have been written without Inevitable Revolutions.
Yeah, so on your first question about Frederick Pike, which I really like that book as well, I don't know. but one thing I want to highlight about what Lorena said, and in case people missed it, I want to make sure that people get this. It's a really important point, which I didn't really think about until just now. So he wrote the first edition of Inevitable Revolutions in 1983, just before, and Lorena did it really well, the United States is on the verge of making some really, really bad decisions. Then in 1992, the second edition comes out, and the tone of the last few chapters of the book is, we did really make those bad decisions, and bad things really did happen. And let's talk about them in an historical way. Let's talk about them in a scholar, activist, public intellectual way, and a way so we can learn further about problems in the U.S. relationship with Latin America. And on your second point, I don't know either about the connection between the two scholars, but I also agree that Brandon's book can't really think of it without thinking of the Wisconsin school. So.
And right here, there's one.
This is a sort of comment, maybe a reminiscence as well. I read The New Empire when I was doing graduate work in a master's program back in the early 80s. And in the 1980s, I was teaching high school history classes at a high school. And I was aware of things bubbling up in Latin America, and especially Central America. And I wanted to understand it more. And since I had read Walter Lefebvre's New Imperialism, I thought, this man seems to know what he's talking about. He's also very readable and approachable for a reader. And I thought, well, this will help me understand what's going on at the time. So that's one of the reasons why I read the book, even though at that time I was not in any doctoral program or anything like that. And perhaps that's why people in Congress were also reading it, because it was approachable, readable.
It's a beautiful synthesis. And Richard, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, and I have somewhat of a personal interest in how you answer this question. Is it on?
Yes.
Do I need it?
We like it.
No, okay. I always felt, from the time of New Empire, that something always drew Walt to Central America. Even though he was, he wrote about everything. And certainly that influenced my own work, in which, I did a little bit of work with Central America as well. So I guess my question is, one, whether you think that Central America, Latin America in general, had a certain attraction for Walt, and if so, why? This isn't in any way to sort of minimize or diminish The Clash or all of his other works, but yet somehow it's like gravity seemed to always bring Walt to Central America, other than, more recently when the Middle East and other things came in. So in terms of inevitable revolution, which I think many of us taught to both undergraduates and graduates, and I used to always use it to frame PhD questions, whether there is something about the dynamics of Central America in terms of, other than what Jim was talking about and the whole idea of inevitable revolutions, that Walt found as a very fertile area to explore sort of his understanding of U.S. foreign relations.
John Quincy Adams. Okay, sorry, that immediately came to mind, and we're supposed to mention in each section, so I got that out of the way. So I don't know of any other sort of gravitational force. I think, like Lorena said, that the third bucket, the third area, is scholar activist, public intellectual activism in the early Reagan period. Clearly, he thought he had to stand up and yell, but in a scholarly, historically contextualized way, right? But I don't really know why he thought it's so important in the early 1980s. Like, this is the time to stand up and be a public intellectual.
Well,
insert myself into this conversation, intervene in this important
if
conversation.
I could just follow that up, I don't. I'm certainly not going to minimize the influence of John Quincy Adams, but I'd go to Seward and Isthmian Canal and all sorts of other things that were so central to him, and then the dynamics that he was doing, and only corridors. I could go on forever. And so whenever I think of Walt, somehow it comes back to Latin America or Central America, even though when we think of open door and that, we're in Asia. So I don't have an answer to this question, but it's always sort of puzzled me. And when I decided to write on Guatemala, Walt wrote me, and it was sort of independent of him, but it was like he was patting me on the back. Yes, this is something that we should explore.
So I'm not sure I have a direct, well, I know I don't have a direct answer because my archival base was rather limited. So I don't have a letter saying I'm looking at Central America for these reasons or but there is part of the article where Jim and I are really talking about how he considered, and he was unapologetic and actually, I could even say chauvinistic about this question, that the question of American empire, how you go from 13 measly colonies or former colonies to a superpower that quickly, that fast, he was really interested in questions of power. And then, as you all reminded me in October, there's the specter of the Vietnam War, so that power might, as much as it's been affected, it might even be ratcheted up. So we can borrow from Grandin and think of Central America as the laboratory. This is where you see the power and the disparity between the countries so enormous. So you can see that power in its fullest manifestation. That would be maybe one reason he was interested in that area in particular.
Actually, I'll just make one brief, not as good as what Lorena said, but one reason why I realized when I got to Cornell I hit the jackpot working with Lefebvre, because I wanted someone who's strong in U.S.-Latin American relations, but also had a global vision. In Central America's Atlantic coast and Pacific coast, the Mississippi Canal, obviously, you have your Pacific Navy and your Atlantic Navy, and so it's a way of looking at U.S.-Latin American relations and international or global history at the same time, but that's not as good as the answer that Lorena did.
That we wrote, yes, okay.
That's not me. I'm not really happy unless I'm a skunk at whatever garden party I'm at. So I want to just I have actually a question that I don't know the answer to, but I want to complicate this a little bit, as academics like to say. I want to complicate this. So I love inevitable revolutions. I use it all the time. I was a columnist for The Nation for 25 years, and I had many occasions to attack U.S. foreign policy in Central America, Iran-Contra. I've been obsessed with Elliott Abrams for my entire adult life. I've written maybe 10 times about him, and the book is very good on Elliott Abrams. One thing you need to know about Elliott Abrams is that Elliott Abrams was the point man on U.S. policy in Central America during a time when the United States was engendering what the UN Truth Commission has described as genocide in Guatemala. I mean, the policies in Nicaragua and El Salvador weren't so great either, but we have the word genocide as an official description of U.S. policy. And Elliott Abrams was attacking the human rights advocates and the journalists who were reporting on this and defending the man, Rios Montt, who has been held guilty of committing genocide. So Henry Kissinger is problematic. A lot of U.S. people are problematic. We have one guy who is guilty of engendering genocide on the record there. Now, this is in, Walt didn't know about the Truth Commission when he wrote it because it hadn't happened yet, but that's all in the book. It's an excellent book. No criticism of the book. Here's the weird thing. Elliott Abrams and Central America during the Reagan administration were like the price that George Shultz was paying to the far right to let him have a reasonable policy with regard to Russia and the rest of the world. He says, you go ahead and do whatever you want. I'm not going to pay attention. You can have it because you people seem to care about it so much. Walt Lefebvre loved George Shultz. If you, I watched the PBS 4-part documentary on Shultz, and Walt is the star of it, saying how much he admired George Shultz and how great he was. So it's a question. He was incredibly critical of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, of whom Elliott Abrams is today a respected member, I'm sorry to say. But on the one hand, he knew everything that had happened in Central America when Shultz was Secretary of State, and yet he had nothing but good things to say about Shultz. I kind of get it. Shultz was a thoughtful man. He didn't jump into things, but still, there's a real problem here. So, sorry.
I agree with you that basically Central America was the raw meat given to the far right, and you got, like you put it very well. You all on the far right, you really care about this, so you can take it over. And then we, the moderate right or whatever, we're going to run the rest of foreign policy. The important stuff like Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. I don't know. Walt wasn't too interested in investigating that in his book. He was more interested in rereading it for this article, like Lorena pointed out. The threat to democracy at home caused by the Reagan administration by attacking the peace groups, the groups that were critical of his policy. It's like, democracy at home is fragile if, you're just going to voice your valid criticisms of, genocide in Central America. We're going to come down on you with the IRS and even the FBI, and we're going to, make your life as difficult as possible because we don't want you to express your dissent clearly to our horrible Central America policy. So he's more interested in that than the other. It's my only half good answer.
And we'll have a tidbit to answer too. I mean, I haven't met George Shultz. My brother has. He says he's one of the most charming individuals he's ever met. Smart as all hell. Really thinks deeply. So that might be part of it. But also, George Shultz was out of the loop on Iran-Contra and thought it was a horrible thing. And I think that really does. I know, but Iran-Contra had a little bit to do with Central America. So, I would think. I mean, it's a tidbit, but I think it's an important point. And otherwise, I don't know. And it was really, I will say, quite frankly, it was a challenge to write this article. Because there's, at some point, we have our archival base is what he wrote. And then, thank goodness, there were other letters. And, we had other pieces. And pointing it together, at some point, we're talking to Tom Holloway. And we're talking to Eduardo Peñalver. And we're just trying to, piece it together. So there's some questions that we don't know the answers to, but I do think that the Schultz's strong condemnation of Iran-Contra made a difference.
Sorry, Anne was next.
Oh, Anne, I'm sorry, Anne.
Anne Foster, PhD 95. So I thought it was on. Now? Sorry. So I think the answer to several of the questions is that, so I also have a very complicated relationship with Walt, especially his relationship to ideas of race. And I think that he was ahead of his time at the beginning of his career. And then even though he moved, he didn't quite move as fast as the profession moved. And we can sort of see some of that. And you're sort of nicely encapsulating, Lorena, how he was concerned about the cheapness of brown lives, and that did, I think, disturb him, but he didn't take it to the next step.
He wasn't a structuralist.
He wasn't a structuralist, but he also didn't take it to the next step to say, we need to do a truly two-sided history where we represent those voices. And partly that was his language abilities, but mostly I think it's actually what you also said. He was mostly concerned about democracy at home and how democracy at home functioned. And he perceived that to be something that happened primarily inside the United States, also slightly concerning to those of us who think about empire as a thing that started in 1776 and has continued to the present, but that could be a conversation over lunch perhaps. But the reason he's so fascinated with Central America is the most likely place the United States takes foreign actions that threaten democracy at home from the beginning. And so that is why he started thinking about that in the new empire. And I think that's why he continues to think about that for the rest of his life. Because it's close by, it's always there, it's something the United States is, there's always support for intervening there, and it always threatens democracy at home. So yes, he cares about other people's lives, he's a good person, and he cares about them. But really his main intellectual and driving sort of emotional concern is democracy in the United States. That's my take on it.
And I would just add that, especially in the department I'm now, to think about race is really, there's many different ways to think about race. And he did often think about race and equality and sensitivity on a very individual and proactive level. So I was always impressed, especially because I taught for years on the quarter system. So we're just launching the quarter system, and then around come the high holidays, right? And somehow, well, there was never an announcement. There was never any like we're going to make a special accommodation. But all of a sudden, if it was Yom Kippur or there'd be an optional lecture, right? So that was like his method. It was not loud. It was like what he as a person could do, right? And so, and as Anna said several times, and Anna's my conduit to this event, quite frankly, is that he was he talked about the field, because when we were in graduate school, I don't know if you guys remember, but why are you getting a PhD in American foreign relations? The field is dead. There are no questions. Who cares? And it's like, that's what I heard over and over. It's like, I don't know. I think it's interesting. So, but he would say, like, yeah, it's top down. Yeah, it's elitist. Yeah, all the Secretary of States, and at the time we were in graduate school, all the presidents, all secretaries had been white men, right? And so, but that also is a way to look at individuals, not structures. And so it's just the frame is a different frame, and it is rooted in the era that he grew up. So, I mean, it's part of, what makes him fascinating.
Is this on? Yes, it is. I wanted to just offer an observation about the Schultz question and
Thank you.
go back briefly to something you said about Grandin and language. But first, I want to just thank Lorena and Jim for this. I knew each of you from your respective first semesters at Cornell, Jim's first semester being my first semester too. And I remember among the first things each of you said to me was, "You're here because of inevitable revolutions." So this has been awesome. Thank you. On Schultz, one of the most, after Walt died, I read virtually everything that appeared on the internet, which I otherwise try to avoid, that I could find. And I forget who wrote it or where it was published, but there was an essay called The Institutionalist, right? Walt was an institutionalist. Mm-hmm. Among his fiercest critiques of Kissinger was the undermining of the State Department as a functioning institution. George Shultz, in a completely separate matter, I had a recent conversation with a colleague. We're not thinking of Walt. I referred to George Shultz as an institutionalist. Right? That's what he appreciated most about Shultz. I haven't seen that PBS documentary, so I can't say there. So that's just one thing. And then going back to Grandin, first of all, I know Walt admired and thought highly of Grandin. I know that Grandin was fundamentally shaped by the Wisconsin school. He and the marvelous Marilyn Young co-taught a seminar at a graduate seminar on American Empire, which was really a seminar on the Wisconsin school, and that Walt was a big influence on Grandin, I do believe. And I actually recently did look at the first chapter of Empire's Workshop, and the footnotes sort of reveal that. But I was struck, Lorena, that you say Grandin, who is a historian of Latin America,
Yes.
writes about U.S. foreign policy.
Well, he was trained by a Brazilianist and a Mexicanist.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, but his PhD is the core field, major field is Latin American history. That he, in your view, and often is writing about Latin America as a monolith, or I forget the word you used, whereas Walt, without the language skills,
Still did it.
has attention to particular societies. That's a remarkable thing. And then the last thing on language in that, Schlesinger, who could never let go of his gripes against the New Left historians with Walt, and because of Walt's writing on the Cold War, enemy number one, perhaps, wrote a scathing review of Inevitable Revolutions. The only point I remember was saying there's no Spanish language sources. Could Schlesinger read Spanish? I don't know. But
Yeah, that review shows up in the article. Yeah, Yeah.
Just a very small point on Schultz. My understanding is that the fascination and appreciation of Schultz has more to do with his interest in technology, which of course was a subject of his Schaefer address, and that I think this comes through in America in the Cold War, that Schultz, as a person who understood the stream of history moving towards computers,
The digital
was
divide. Yeah.
more important than anything else in his appreciation of Schultz.
Andy, do you want to add anything? Yeah, didn't you get the two together for lunch? Oops. Yes. Put you on the spot, sorry.
I think one of the great events in my life was I had the opportunity to introduce Walt to George Schultz at lunch one day. The three of us talked. I was more in awe of the fact that I was sitting between these two giants, but I just remember that each of them had the greatest respect for each other, and it was like listening to two philosophers talk almost a language I couldn't understand. But I know that each one had great feeling for the other and for the other's work, and great appreciation for it. That's, it was 45 minutes, and I can't remember exactly what was said, and I didn't take notes.
Do you remember the date?
1920.
1920.
I think it was about 2016.
2016. Okay, recent.
I can find out the date easily.
Thank you.
Do we have any last comments from Jim or Lorena? Then I think we'll call it a close and end on that final note from Andrew Tisch. So thank you. I understand lunch is in the hallway and that it's an extremely nice day outside, possibly the last one for a long time. So you may want to take that into consideration.
Oh, thank you so much.
Did it work out? Here we go.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much.